The wind on the high Wyoming plains always had something to say. In 1878, it mostly talked about loneliness. It was a sharp, whining sound that clawed at the walls of Cora's little shack, a never-ending sermon on just how empty the world was. The shack was just a stubborn little box of wood her father had built, a place to hold back the endless ocean of sagebrush and sky. It was her parents' home, and for 3 long years, it had been just hers. Cora didn't talk back. She was a creature made of silence, not just because she lived miles from anyone, a full day's ride from the dusty spit of a town they called Providence. The silence was deeper than that. It was a room inside her soul that she'd locked the day she watched the fever steal her mother's breath, and then watched grief steal her father's will to live just a season later. The world had turned into a place of loud noises and sharp corners after that, and silence was the only armor she had left. She was 17, but small for her age. Her hair was the color of dry corn silk, her eyes the color of a gathering storm, always wide, like they were stuck replaying a horror they couldn't forget. Her whole life was a quiet dance of survival. Wake up, break the ice in the water barrel, watch her breath turn to smoke in the freezing air. Check the snares she'd set for rabbits, her small hands sure and chapped as they handled the cold wire. Most days, the snares were empty. Her stomach would answer with a familiar, hollow clench. She'd spend the rest of the day fighting, mending her father's old coat until it was more stitches than wool, grinding the last bit of flour into a thin, sad biscuit. Her world wasn't made of words, it was made of feelings. The rough scrape of firewood, the sharp scent of pine, the dusty smell of the dry earth. Sounds were far-away things. The caw of a raven, the skittering of a mouse in the wall, and always the sighing of the wind. It was a life boiled down to the bone, and it was achingly, profoundly lonely, but she didn't feel sorry for herself. Self-pity was a fire she couldn't afford the fuel to burn. She just was, a ghost in her own story. The land didn't mind her silence. The vast, empty plains didn't ask her for words she couldn't find. It was brutal, and it was beautiful, and she understood it in her bones. She was just another silent thread in its massive, lonely quilt. Then, one afternoon, with the sky looking like a lead plate and the air tasting of snow, Cora pushed farther than she normally would. Hunger was a mean master, and the rabbits had been scarce. She was checking a line of snares in a rocky draw, the wind pulling at her thin dress like an angry ghost when she found it. The snare was empty. A cold spike of despair drove through her. She knelt to reset the trap, her fingers numb, her spirit close to breaking. And that's when she heard it. It was a sound that didn't belong. It wasn't the wind, and it wasn't an animal she knew. It was a low, deep groan, like a giant tree finally giving up and splintering apart. Fear shot through her, hot and electric. Her first thought was to run, to get back to the shack, bar the door, and pretend she heard nothing. She was just a girl, alone, and her father's stories of the dangers on these plains were vivid in her mind. But the sound came again. It was pure agony. It was a sound that didn't need words to be understood. It spoke directly to the bruised, silent part of her heart that still remembered what it was to feel. Slowly, her heart hammering like a trapped bird against her ribs, she rose. She moved toward the sound, creeping through a stand of juniper trees. And then she saw him. He was lying at the bottom of a rock outcropping, almost hidden in the shadows. He was Cheyenne. You could see it in the proud lines of his face, the long black hair, the beaded leather of his leggings. But all that finery was ruined, stained dark and wet with blood. A deep, ragged tear ran across his ribs, and another wound gaped at his shoulder. His face, which should have looked strong and full of authority, was pale and tight with pain. He looked like a fallen king. A beautiful paint horse stood nearby, nuzzling its master's limp hand, trying to wake him. Every warning she'd ever heard screamed at her to run. The whispers in Providence about savage warriors, about brutal raids. He was the other, the danger, the reason she was supposed to stay locked away. But as she watched, another groan ripped from his lips. His body convulsed. And for a second, his eyes flickered open and met hers. And in that gaze, she didn't see a savage. She saw a man wounded and dying. A man as alone in his pain as she was in her silence. His eyes held no hate, just a dazed confusion and a spark of defiance that even death couldn't quite put out. A war started inside her. Leave him. It's not your fight. To help him could bring a world of trouble you can't handle. That was the voice of survival, the voice that had kept her alive for 3 years. But another voice, one she hadn't heard in a long time, whispered back. It was the part of her that remembered her mother's gentle touch, the part that knew the ice-cold sting of being abandoned. To leave him here would be to become just as cruel as the world that had shattered her. Her choice wasn't a thought, it was an action. She took a deep breath of the freezing air and stepped out from behind the trees. The paint horse tossed its head, startled, but the man's eyes stayed locked on her. She walked toward him slowly, her hands held out, open and empty. She meant no harm. She knelt beside him, and the smell of blood hit her. The wounds were bad. They looked like they came from a rifle. His skin was hot, burning with fever. He wouldn't last the night out here, not with the snow already starting to fall. He was a big man, solid muscle and bone. She was small and wiry. Getting him to the shack felt impossible, but desperation is its own kind of strength. She managed to get his arm over her shoulders, his weight a crushing burden. She started the long, slow walk back home, the horse following behind them like a sad shadow. Every single step was a battle. His groans of pain mixed with her own ragged, desperate breaths. The world shrank to just the few feet of ground in front of her, the dying sun, and the heavy, wounded man who was now her responsibility. By the time she dragged him through the door of her shack, the sky was dark and the snow was coming down in thick, silent flakes. The shack, which had always felt so vast and empty, was suddenly shockingly small. His presence filled it. It was like she'd dragged a piece of the wild, untamed wilderness inside, and his pain and fever were sucking all the air out of the room. She got him onto her cot, the only soft place she had, and he collapsed onto the thin mattress, his eyes closing. For a long moment, Cora just stood there, shaking. The reality of what she had done hit her like a physical blow. She had brought a stranger, a wounded warrior, a man her people considered an enemy, into the very heart of her world. The silence was different now. It wasn't empty anymore. It was heavy, charged with fear and the presence of another person. But there was no time for second thoughts. His breathing was shallow, and the wound in his side had started bleeding again. She shook off the fear. She stoked the fire, the flames pushing back the shadows. She put water on to boil, the hiss and bubble a strangely comforting sound. From a small wooden chest, she pulled out her mother's things: clean linen rags, a needle and thread, and a little tin of herbal salve that smelled of pine. These were the last pieces of a life where people cared for each other. She gently cut away the blood-stiffened leather of his shirt. The wounds were worse up close. One bullet seemed to have gone clean through his shoulder, but the other one looked like it was still in there, deep in his side. She didn't know how to get a bullet out, but she knew how to clean a wound. She knew how to stop the bleeding. With a basin of hot water, she started to work. Her touch was shaky at first, then it became steady. He woke up while she was cleaning the wound on his ribs. His whole body went tense. His eyes flew open, sharp with pain and a deep, primal suspicion. He let out a low growl and tried to sit up, to push her away. Cora froze, her heart trying to climb out of her throat. She held up her hands, showing him the clean cloth, the basin of water. Her face was a silent plea. "I have no words. I can't explain. Please, just understand." He stared at her for a long, breathless moment. His eyes were like black stones, and they were trying to see right through her, into the silent, scared rooms of her soul. He was looking for a threat, but all he saw was a slip of a girl with haunted eyes and hands that trembled but didn't stop their work. Slowly, with a huge effort of will, he relaxed back onto the cot. It wasn't trust. Not yet. But it was a chance. She worked for over an hour, cleaning, packing the wounds with salve, binding them tight with linen strips. He took the pain with a stillness that amazed her. His jaw was clenched so tight the muscles stood out, his knuckles were white where he gripped the cot, but he never made another sound. When she was done, he was drenched in sweat and pale as a ghost, but his breathing was a little easier. She sat back on her heels, completely exhausted. The snow was a blizzard now, a thick white curtain hiding them from the world. The wind howled and rattled the little window pane. He started to shiver, the fever and the cold working together to kill him. Cora looked at him, shivering on her cot. Then she looked at her one thin blanket, folded at the end of it. It was a patchwork of old wool and flannel. It was the only thing that had kept her from freezing to death on 100 winter nights. It was her survival. Without even thinking about it, she picked it up. It smelled of wood smoke and her. She unfolded it and gently laid it over his broad shoulders, tucking it in around him. His eyes opened again. He watched her. He looked at the blanket, this precious gift of warmth. Then he looked at her, standing there in her thin dress, shivering as a draft slithered through a crack in the wall. He understood. He understood what she had just given him. It wasn't just a blanket. It was life. And for the first time, the suspicion in his eyes softened. It was replaced by something else, something deeper. He gave her a tiny, almost invisible nod. It was a bridge, a fragile little bridge built across the huge, silent gap between their worlds. That night, Cora slept on the hard, cold floor by the fire, wrapped in her father's threadbare coat. She listened to the storm raging outside and the strangers breathing inside. She was colder than she'd ever been. But for the first time in 3 years, she wasn't entirely alone. The next few days passed in a strange, quiet rhythm. The blizzard buried them for 2 days straight, trapping them in a small, silent world of white. Inside the shack, a truce was formed without a single word being spoken. Cora tended the fire, melted snow for water, and checked on her patient. He mostly slept, his body fighting a war against the fever. She'd spoon a thin broth into his mouth when he was awake enough to swallow. She'd bathe his hot face with a cool, damp cloth. She didn't know his name was Mocha Tavato. She didn't know he was a great chief, a man of peace trying to lead his people through a world that was closing in on them. She didn't know the bullets in his body had come from a whiskey trader he had forbidden from his camp, a man who sold poison to his people. She didn't know he'd been ambushed, left for dead, and had ridden until his body finally gave out right where she found him. In her shack, he wasn't a chief. He was just a man, stripped of everything, completely dependent on a silent girl. And he watched her. He watched everything. He saw the holes in the soles of her shoes. He saw how she carefully rationed their tiny amount of food. He saw the deep, permanent sadness that lived in her storm-colored eyes. He saw her strength, too. It was a quiet thing, like the prairie grass that bends in the wind but refuses to break. He noticed she never spoke, not even a whisper to herself. He saw how she flinched at any loud noise, how she would wrap her arms around her waist as if she was trying to hold her own broken pieces together. On the 3rd day, the fever broke. Mokatavato woke up, and the world was clear. The shack was filled with a pale, bright light, reflecting off the new snow. The pain in his side was still there, but it was a clean, sharp fire now, not the dull, consuming inferno it had been. Cora was by the fire, sharpening her father's skinning knife on a wet stone. She looked up. She saw he was awake, and that he was really seeing her for the first time. She got up and brought him a cup of water. He drank, his eyes never leaving hers over the rim of the tin cup. When he handed it back, their fingers brushed. It was just for a second, but it was like a spark. A jolt of connection. He gestured to his wounds, then looked at her, his eyes asking a question. She understood. She gently pulled back the blanket and lifted the edge of the bandage on his side. The angry red skin around the wound had faded. It was starting to heal. A look of pure relief washed over his face, and it was followed by something else, a profound, soul-deep gratitude. Their world became a silent play of gestures. He'd point to the water bucket. She'd go fill it with snow. She'd hold up a rabbit she'd finally caught. He'd nod his approval. The crushing loneliness that had been Cora's only companion started to fade. The silence in the shack was no longer empty. It was full of a quiet understanding, a respect that was growing in the space where words should have been. But as he was healing, she found something that changed everything. She was changing the bandages on his side, the ones that had been soaked with blood when she found him. As she carefully unwrapped the old linen, something fell out from a hidden pocket in his leggings. It was small and made of metal, attached to a delicate chain. It was a locket. Her fingers trembled as she picked it up. It was finely made, not something you'd expect a Cheyenne warrior to carry. She pressed the tiny clasp and it clicked open. Inside, there wasn't a carving or a stone. There was a tiny painted picture, a portrait. It was a woman with blonde hair and blue eyes, a white woman, and she was holding a small child, a little girl with the same fair hair. Cora stared at it, her mind reeling. Who was this woman? Who was this child? Why was this Cheyenne man carrying a picture of them, hidden away like a precious secret? Was he not who he seemed? Was this a trophy from a raid? A stolen memory from a family he'd destroyed? The questions swirled in her head, dark and terrifying. The fragile trust she had started to build suddenly felt like it was standing on the edge of a cliff. The man on her cot was no longer just a patient. He was a mystery with a dark and potentially violent past. She quickly closed the locket, her heart pounding. She tucked it back into his pocket before he could see, but she couldn't unknow what she had seen. She looked at him, sleeping peacefully now, and a new kind of fear took root. Not the fear of a stranger, but the fear that she was helping a monster. A week after she found him, Mocha Tavato was strong enough to sit up. One afternoon, Cora was trying to drag a heavy log inside for the fire. She was grunting with the effort, her small frame no match for the weight. Just as her grip was about to fail, he was there. He moved slowly, his face tight with pain, but he took the other end of the log. Together, they carried it inside. It was a simple thing, but it changed the room. He wasn't her patient anymore. They were partners. They were surviving together. He started helping in small ways. He showed her a better way to fletch the arrows for her father's old bow. Then one day, he took a piece of firewood and her small knife and began to carve. He sat by the fire for hours, completely focused, as small shavings of wood fell to the floor. He was carving a horse, a perfect, beautiful horse, its head thrown back, its mane flowing like it was caught in the wind. It looked just like the proud paint horse that was now healing in the lean-to she'd built. When he was done, he held it out to her. A gift. Cora took it. Her fingers traced the smooth, perfect lines. The questions about the locket, the fear, it all seemed to fade away as she looked at this beautiful thing he had created. A man who could make something like this. Could he really be a monster? She looked at him, her eyes shining with an emotion she hadn't felt in years. She turned, walked to her small chest, and from the very bottom, she pulled out a small, oval picture frame. It held a faded photograph of her parents, smiling, their arms around each other. She had never shown it to another living soul. She held it out to him. Mokotavato took it, and he held it with a strange reverence. He studied the faces in the photograph. Then he looked up at Cora, and he saw it. He saw the resemblance. He saw her loss. He saw where her silence came from. He handed it back to her gently, and his eyes were full of a deep, sad understanding. In that moment, she forgot all about the locket. They weren't a white girl and a Cheyenne chief. They were just two people who knew what it felt like to have your world torn apart. He had seen her past. She had seen the artist inside of him, and the walls between them turned to dust. But what they didn't know was that their quiet little world was about to be discovered, and the man who found them would see something else entirely. The town of Providence wasn't much of a town. It was more like a scar on the prairie, a single dusty street with a saloon, a general store, and a few shacks. It was a place for men running from something, or running toward a fortune they'd likely never find. It was a place that ran on suspicion and boredom. Garrett Shaw was a man made for Providence. He was a trapper with a mean streak, and the belief that any land he walked on was his. He knew about the orphan girl in the old hail shack. He mostly thought of her with a mix of pity and contempt. A woman living alone out here, it just wasn't right. About 2 weeks after the big storm, Shaw was checking his trap lines when he saw the tracks. They were faint in the melting snow, but they were clear. The tracks of a shod horse, not a wild one, and right beside them, the unmistakable print of a Cheyenne moccasin. His eyes narrowed. A cold curiosity took hold. He followed them. The tracks led him straight into the rocky draw not far from Cora's place. There, he found more signs, a patch of ground stained with old, dried blood, signs of a struggle, and from that spot, the tracks, both the moccasins and the smaller boot prints of the girl, led directly to Cora's shack. He didn't just walk up to the door. Shaw was a hunter. He circled around, using the trees for cover. He took out his spyglass and found a good spot in a stand of aspens. He saw the girl Cora come out and throw a bucket of dirty water. Nothing strange about that. But then he focused on the lean-to, and he saw the horse. A fine paint horse, the kind the Cheyenne prized. His grip on the spyglass tightened. As he watched, the shack door opened again. A man stepped out into the sun to stretch. It was him, the Cheyenne warrior. He moved a little stiffly, like a man on the mend, but he was there, living with the girl. A dark, ugly poison seeped into Garrett Shaw's mind. He didn't see a man recovering from an injury. He saw a savage, a buck who had taken advantage of a helpless, lonely girl. His mind filled with dark, twisted pictures, images fueled by years of fear and prejudice. He lowered the spyglass, his face a hard mask of certainty. He knew what he had to do. He was a protector. He was the guardian of civilization against the wild. He rode for Providence like a man possessed, his horse churning up mud and slush. He didn't slow down until he burst through the doors of the saloon. The low chatter of drinking men died instantly. Every eye turned to him. "There's a Cheyenne buck holed up at the Hale place," he announced, his voice loud and full of grim authority. "The orphan girl, Cora. She's with him. I saw it with my own 2 eyes." A nervous ripple went through the room. These were bored, hard men. And this was the most exciting thing that had happened all winter. "Are you sure, Garrett?" The storekeeper, a nervous little man named Miller, asked. "Saw him plain as day," Shaw spat, his voice rising with theatrical fury. "He's a warrior, I tell you, wounded, probably from some raid, and he's got that girl trapped in there. Lord only knows what he's already done to her, and what he plans to do to us when he's healed up." He was playing them like a fiddle. He poked at their deepest fears, fear of attack, fear for their women, fear of the people who were here long before them. He painted Cora not as a rescuer, but as a victim, a foolish girl whose softness had now put them all in danger. "We can't just leave him there. a man shouted from the bar. He'll bring others, another one added, his eyes wide. A whole war party. The fear, fanned into a fire by Shaw's words, quickly turned to anger. It was the best kind of anger, a righteous anger, the kind that makes a man feel brave. They weren't a mob. No, they were protectors. They weren't driven by hate. They were driven by necessity. Within an hour, Garrett Shaw had his posse, a dozen men, farmers, prospectors, drifters, all of them armed with old rifles and a shared, ugly purpose. As the sun began to bleed across the western sky, they rode out of Providence, a grim parade, heading for a lonely shack on the prairie. They were coming to deliver their own special brand of justice. Cora heard it first, a deep, rhythmic thudding. It was a sound that didn't travel through the air, but up through the frozen ground itself, an alien sound in her world of wind and silence. She was outside, scattering the last of her chicken feed. Mokotavato was splitting kindling, his movements slow but deliberate. He heard it too. He went perfectly still, his head cocked to the side. His expression hardened in an instant. He looked at Cora, and she saw the same sharp alarm in his eyes that was now squeezing her own heart. Then they saw them. A dark line of riders on the nearest ridge, black shapes against the fiery orange of the sunset. They weren't traveling. They were riding with a purpose. A grim, terrifying purpose. Cora's blood went cold. She knew, with a gut-wrenching certainty, who they were, and she knew why they were coming. Mokotavato grabbed her arm, his voice a low rasp. It was one of the first sounds she'd ever heard him make. He pulled her back inside the shack. His strength was almost fully back, and he moved with a warrior's grace. The near-dead man she'd found was completely gone. He pushed her behind him and barred the door. He moved to the window, peering through a tiny crack in the shutter. Cora's heart was hammering so hard she thought she might be sick. The dozen men surrounded their tiny home, their faces hard and unreadable in the dying light. Garrett Shaw swung down from his horse, his rifle held loose in his hands. "Cora Hale," he yelled, his voice cutting through the evening stillness. "You in there? Come on out. We know you ain't alone." Cora shrank back, pressing herself against the rough wood of the wall. Mokotavato glanced at her. His face was calm, but his eyes were burning with a fierce, protective fire. He reached down and picked up the heavy iron poker from the fireplace. It was a pathetic weapon against a dozen rifles. But he held it like it was a king's sword. "We don't want to hurt you, girl," Shaw called out again, his voice dripping with a false, patronizing sweetness. "We're here to help you. Just send out the savage, and we'll leave you be." The word savage hit Cora like a slap. Savage? They were talking about the man who carved a beautiful horse from a piece of firewood, the man who had looked at her parents' picture with a sorrow that mirrored her own, the man who helped her carry a log when he could barely stand. The fear that had been her companion for 3 long years began to burn away, and in its place, a hot, bright flame of anger started to grow. An anger she had forgotten she was capable of feeling. Mokotavato moved toward the door. He was going to face them. He was going to die fighting, right here, on her floor. But Cora put a hand on his arm. She stopped him. She shook her head, a single fierce motion. No. This was her home. These men outside, they were her people, her kind. And they were the ones bringing the violence. She would not let this man die for her. She would not hide behind him. She took a deep, shuddering breath, unbarred the door, and stepped outside. She stood on the small porch, a tiny, defiant figure in a worn-out dress, blinking in the twilight. She pulled the door shut behind her, shielding Mokotavato from their sight. Shaw managed a thin, ugly smile. "That's a good girl. Now just step aside. Tell your friend to come on out with his hands empty." Cora didn't move. She looked at their faces, men she'd seen in town, men who usually looked right through her, like she was a ghost. Now they were all staring at her, their eyes full of suspicion and menace. She shook her head, one sharp, clear motion. No. Shaw's smile disappeared. Don't be a fool, girl. He's filled your head with lies. He's a danger to us all. Now get out of the way. Again, Cora shook her head. Her body was trembling from head to toe, but her spine felt like a column of solid iron. For the first time since her parents died, she wasn't running. She wasn't hiding. She was standing for something. For someone. Last chance, Shaw growled, and he raised his rifle, aiming it right at her chest. The other men followed his lead. The sound of a dozen rifles being cocked echoed in the tense, heavy silence. The world seemed to stop. The wind died. The birds went silent. It was the moment before the world exploded. And then a new sound began. It started soft, a deep, pervasive drumming that seemed to be coming from the earth itself. It was the sound of hoofbeats. No, not just hoofbeats. It was the sound of 1,000 hoofbeats, a soft thunder that grew steadily, rapidly louder. Every single man in the posse turned. Their confident, angry faces went slack with confusion, then with a stark, naked terror. Over the ridge where they had just ridden, and the ridge behind that one, and the one behind that, figures began to appear. They were dark silhouettes against the last dying glow of the sun. Warriors on horseback. Their faces were painted, not for war, but with a solemn, serious purpose. They lined the crests of the hills, their numbers swelling until it seemed like the hills themselves were rising up, giving birth to a silent, unstoppable army. There were hundreds of them, then 1,000, maybe more. An entire nation, sitting on their horses, watching the small, pathetic scene in the valley below. They held bows, lances, rifles, but they didn't make a move. They just waited. Their presence was a physical weight, crushing the air, a silent, overwhelming testament to the power of the man inside the shack. The door opened behind Cora. Mocha Tavato stepped out to stand beside her. He was no longer just a man, he was a chief. He stood tall and straight, his gaze sweeping over the terrified faces of the posse with cold, regal authority. Then he lifted his eyes to meet the gaze of his people on the hills. He raised a single hand, and on the highest ridge, a lone warrior raised a lance in reply. Garrett Shaw stared, his mouth hanging open. The righteous anger, the cheap courage born of fear and ignorance, it all just evaporated. All that was left was a cold, primal dread. He and his men weren't a posse of protectors. They were a handful of mice who had just tried to corner a lion. The power dynamic hadn't just shifted, it had been completely obliterated. He looked from the silent, watching army to the chief standing beside the small, mute girl. And for the first time in his miserable life, Garrett Shaw understood the true, catastrophic scale of his mistake. Slowly, clumsily, he lowered his rifle. The other men, their faces white as ash, did the same. Without another word, Shaw turned, scrambled onto his horse, and spurred it into a frantic, panicked retreat. The rest of the posse fell apart, each man for himself, fleeing not from a battle, but from the sheer, terrifying weight of their own insignificance. They scattered across the plains and were swallowed by the growing darkness. The silence that fell after the posse fled was deeper than any silence Cora had ever known. It was a holy silence, filled with awe. The 1,000 warriors on the ridges didn't move. They were a ring of silent, living mountains that had risen from the earth to protect their leader. A few riders detached themselves from the main group and rode down the hill to the shack. They dismounted with a quiet dignity. Their faces were stern, but their eyes were filled with a deep relief as they looked at their chief. They spoke to Mocha Tavato in the flowing, musical tones of the Cheyenne language. He answered them, his voice calm, full of command. When they were finished, he turned to Cora. The last light of the setting sun bathed them in gold, and in that light, the vast canyon between their two worlds seemed to vanish. He stood before her, no longer a patient, no longer a refugee. He was the great chief Moka Tavato. But when he looked at her, his eyes were filled with a humility and a gratitude that no title could diminish. He placed his right hand over his heart. Then he extended his open palm toward her. It wasn't goodbye. It was a sign of the deepest respect, an acknowledgement of a debt that could never truly be repaid. He had no words in her language to tell her what she had done for him. He didn't need them. She saw it all in his eyes. Thank you for your courage. Thank you for your compassion. Thank you for your sacrifice. She hadn't just saved his life. She had seen his humanity when his own people couldn't find him, and when her people wanted to destroy him. One of the warriors stepped forward. He gently laid a large bundle, wrapped in tanned deerskin, at her feet. Then, with one last, meaningful look, Moka Tavado mounted the fresh horse his men had brought for him. He sat tall and proud, a leader once more among his people. He turned his horse not back the way they came, but west, toward the heart of their lands. The entire sea of warriors on the hills turned as one and followed him. They flowed like a great silent river across the landscape, until the last rider dipped below the horizon. And the plains were empty again. Cora stood alone in the twilight, the cold air on her cheeks. She was alone. But everything was different. The solitude was not the same. The silence that filled her little shack was no longer the heavy blanket of loneliness. It was the quiet calm of peace. She knelt and untied the bundle. Inside were treasures beyond her wildest dreams. Thick, warm buffalo and beaver furs. A large pouch made from a bladder, filled with dried berries and jerky. A brand new skinning knife with a beautifully carved bone handle. And a new fire striker. It was a gift of pure survival, a promise that she would not have to face the coming winter, hungry and cold. Tucked inside the furs was one last thing. It was the small wooden horse he had carved. She picked up the warmest of the furs, a magnificent buffalo robe, and wrapped it around her shoulders. It was heavy, and it smelled of wood smoke and sage and a world she had only just brushed up against. She stood in the doorway of her home that she had defended, and looked up at the sky, now dusted with 1 billion brilliant stars. The wind was picking up again, but it didn't sound lonely anymore. It sounded like it was whispering a story about a forgotten orphan girl who had been taught to fear the world, but had chosen to show it kindness instead. Her voice was still locked away deep inside her, but her spirit was no longer silent. She had stared down a mob. She had been protected by an army, and she had earned the respect of a chief. She wasn't just a sad little ghost from a tragic past anymore. She was Cora Hale, the girl who gave away her only blanket, and in return was given back her own life. If you believe a single act of kindness can change the world, don't forget to like and subscribe, because you never know when a simple choice will echo across the plains.